The sinister truth behind a Dubai affair. Murder, secrets, and lies. A hook. What if everything you thought you knew about your life was a lie? Step into a world where every decision is a deadly game, and there's no way out. In this chilling story, a man finds himself trapped in a web of secrets, danger, and betrayal. Will he survive the game, or will it consume him whole? Keep watching, because the truth is darker than you can imagine. The city buzzed with life, but inside the penthouse, all was quiet. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and leather. A lone figure stood by the window, his fingers pressed against the cool glass. Below, the streets of Dubai sprawled out, alive with movement. But up here, in this high-rise tower, the world felt distant. His heart beat fast, too fast. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears. A soft click behind him. He didn't turn around, not yet. His mind raced. She had called him, her voice trembling, urgent. "I need to see you. Tonight." But he hadn't expected this. He felt her presence before he saw her. The room grew heavier. Her perfume wafted through the air. Expensive, intoxicating. But something was different. A slight pressure on his back. A whisper, barely audible. "Do you know what you've done?" He froze. The words echoed in his mind. He hadn't wanted this. None of it. The silence was suffocating. He could feel the tension building. His breath quickened. A flicker of movement caught his eye. She stepped into view. Her eyes locked on his. Cold. Unforgiving. He tried to speak, but no words came. His throat tightened. She stepped closer. The floor creaked beneath her heels. He could see the faintest glint of something in her hand. A blade. His pulse skipped. Was it all coming to this? "Did you think you could get away with it?" she asked. Her voice was low, almost like a hiss. He swallowed hard. His stomach twisted in knots. The memories hit him all at once. The affair. The lies. The secrets buried deep in the shadows. Her finger traced the edge of the blade. Sharp. Deadly. "You thought you could leave me behind," she continued, her tone venomous. "You thought you could run from the truth." He couldn't breathe. The room spun. She moved closer. The blade glinted in the dim light. "Now," she whispered, "now you'll pay." Her breath was steady, calm, but the danger in her eyes was unmistakable. He could feel the cold steel of the blade just inches from his skin. Every muscle in his body tensed, frozen by fear. His thoughts were a blur. His mind screamed for him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. His gaze locked on the weapon, watching it shimmer in the low light. "Please," he whispered. The word felt foreign on his tongue, weak, but she didn't respond. Her eyes never left his. Her expression was unreadable. "You had it all," she said softly, her voice like a warning. "You took everything from me." Her grip tightened on the blade, a small, silent movement, but it sent a chill down his spine. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. The betrayal, the lies, the promises made in the darkness, now shattered in the cold light of reality. "All I wanted," she continued, her voice a quiet growl, "was the truth." His pulse pounded in his ears, louder than ever. It felt like the air around him had thickened, heavy with her anger. The seconds stretched, painfully slow. He wanted to speak, to beg for mercy, but no words came. She took a step forward. The tip of the blade grazed his skin. Just a whisper of a touch. His heart hammered in his chest. His breath came in shallow gasps. Then, without warning, she jerked the blade away. His body flinched, but she didn't strike. Not yet. He couldn't understand. What was she waiting for? Her eyes flickered to the side briefly, and in that moment he saw it. A flash of something he had never noticed before. Something in her hand, wasn't just a blade. It was a key that could unlock the truth he had buried so deep, the truth that would destroy them both. The key gleamed in her hand, its shape unmistakable, a small, innocuous object, yet it held the power to unravel everything. His breath caught in his throat. It was the key to the safe he thought was hidden, the safe where he had kept the most damning secrets. He had been so careful, but he had underestimated her. "Do you remember this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were cold, calculating. His pulse quickened. He knew what she was implying, knew what she was about to do. She raised the key just inches from his face. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The city below, the penthouse walls. It was just him, her, and that damned key. "What's inside, I wonder?" she murmured, twisting it between her fingers. He couldn't breathe. Every thought he had, every plan felt like it was crumbling. The walls were closing in. "Tell me," she pressed. "Tell me why you betrayed me." The words were a weight, heavy. He couldn't escape them. "I didn't mean to," he finally said, his voice shaky. "I never wanted any of this. It just happened." Her laugh was soft, empty. "You think that makes it better?" The key hung in the air between them, a promise of something worse, something darker. "I'll open it," she said, her tone flat. "Then we'll see whose life is destroyed." His eyes darted to the door, to the window, to any escape. But there was nowhere to run, no way to undo the mess he had made. The blade flickered again, just out of reach. Her grip loosened on it. Her other hand tightened around the key. She stepped back. The room seemed to grow colder. "Do you remember where it is?" she asked, her voice sharp now. Her gaze was unblinking. His mind raced. The safe was hidden behind the painting in the hallway. He had been sure it was foolproof, but she had outsmarted him. "Get it," she commanded. Her voice was cold, unfeeling. He turned slowly, his feet dragging with the weight of inevitability. The hallway seemed longer now, as if it were stretching into eternity. The painting, he could almost see it now, its frame solid and unmoving. He had made his choice the moment he crossed that line with her. Every step toward the hallway felt like a descent into darkness. His hand trembled as he reached for the painting. It was an abstract piece, bright and chaotic. He had always found it beautiful, but now it felt like a mask, hiding something far darker. His fingers brushed the frame, cold, solid. He could feel the faint pulse of tension in the air, thick with anticipation. She was watching him. He pulled the painting away from the wall, slowly. The hidden safe stood behind it, barely noticeable. His heart pounded louder with every passing second. The safe, the very thing that could unravel him. "Open it," she commanded, her voice low but sharp. Her gaze was unrelenting, as if the moment he hesitated would be his undoing. His fingers fumbled with the combination. It felt like the numbers on the dial were mocking him. Each turn of the dial seemed to echo through the room, louder and louder. He glanced back at her. She didn't move, her eyes fixed on him like a predator. Finally, the safe clicked open. He froze. Inside, the documents were stacked neatly. A few photos, an envelope, the secrets, the ones he had carefully hidden away. He reached in, his hand shaking. Every file, every photo seemed to burn into his skin as he pulled them free. A feeling of dread washed over him. The truth had been buried in here, waiting for the right moment to surface. "You thought I wouldn't find out," she whispered, her voice growing colder. He stood there holding the envelope. The weight of it felt like lead in his hand. This was the moment he had feared the most. Slowly he opened it. Inside were letters, messages, proof of everything they had done to each other. The lies, the betrayals, and the one thing he had never expected to see. Her name, written across the pages. The same name that had haunted him for months. He felt a chill seep into his bones. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger. She stepped forward, closer. Her hand reached for the envelope, her eyes never leaving his. He couldn't move. The key, the blade, the truth. It was all too much. "You see," she said, her voice cold and final. "I always knew." Her fingers brushed against his as she took the envelope from his hand. The touch sent a jolt through him, as if the coldness of her skin was a reminder of everything he had tried to bury. She flipped through the pages with a detached calm, each one marking the end of something he could never undo. "You thought you could control this," she said softly, her eyes scanning the letters, the photos. "Did you think you could bury the truth and walk away?" He didn't answer. His throat was dry. His breath caught in his chest. The quiet in the room was suffocating now. Her eyes flickered to the blade in her other hand, and for a moment, it felt like the entire room held its breath. "You've made a mess of everything," she continued, her tone barely audible. "But you're not the only one with secrets, are you?" His heart skipped. The words didn't make sense. What was she saying? Slowly, she let the papers slip from her fingers, falling to the floor in a quiet cascade. Her gaze never wavered from his. "You see, I knew what you were hiding," she said, her voice ice cold now. "But it's not the affair that bothers me. Not anymore." His pulse raced. The room felt smaller, closer. She stepped even closer, her heels clicking on the floor like the ticking of a clock, counting down to something irreversible. "You betrayed me, yes," she continued, her voice a whisper of venom. "But you didn't know the full story. You didn't know what I was planning." His breath caught. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Her eyes gleamed with a twisted sort of satisfaction. What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice barely a murmur. Her smile was chilling, a slight curve of her lips that sent a wave of unease through his body. "Everything," she said, "everything you thought you knew is wrong. The affair was just a distraction. The key, the documents, they were never about you." His mind reeled. The world seemed to tilt beneath him. What was she saying? She reached into her pocket, pulling out another item, a small, unmarked envelope. He stared at it. "Do you recognize this?" she asked, her voice almost playful now. The color drained from his face as he realized what it was. It was a photo of him, standing, smiling, at a place he had never been, a location he had never visited. It was a setup. "You were never meant to get away with it," she whispered. "Not just with me, but with everyone." The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. The lies, the affair, the key, it was all part of something much darker. And now it was too late to escape. He staggered back, the walls closing in. His mind raced, but everything was a blur. The photo in her hand was like a confession, a betrayal. He had never been to that place, yet there he was, captured in the frame. The reality of what she was saying crashed down on him. "You thought this was about us," she said, her voice smooth, cold. "But it's never been just about us." His breath was shallow. He struggled to piece the fragments together. Who else knew? What was she planning? She took a step closer, her heels clicking with deliberate precision, each sound like a countdown. "You see," she continued, "this was always about power." She raised the photo to his face, forcing him to look at it. He felt his stomach churn. "I was never the victim," she whispered. "The real game is far more complicated." He looked at the photo again, a place he had never seen, yet it haunted him now. Was it staged? Who had taken it? "You're not the first one I've dealt with," she added. Her smile never faltered. "You won't be the last." Suddenly everything clicked. The affair, the secrecy, the lies that went far beyond what he had ever imagined. The truth had never been simple. It wasn't about love or betrayal. It was about manipulation. She had been using him, and now it was his turn to pay. He glanced toward the door, but it felt so far away. The air felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on him. "Who else is involved?" he managed to choke out, his voice barely audible. She tilted her head, almost amused. "Does it matter?" His heart pounded harder. Her words had a finality to them. Everything he thought he knew was slipping away, and in its place was a nightmare. She stepped back, slowly. She held the key in one hand, the photo in the other. Her eyes glinted with dark satisfaction. "Now you'll understand," she said, her voice low and laced with menace. "Everything you've done, everything you've hidden." The blade in her hand gleamed again, its edge catching the dim light. But it wasn't for him. It was for someone else. Someone he hadn't even realized was in the crossfire. And then, just as quickly, she turned, disappearing into the shadows of the penthouse. The room was silent. Too silent. He stood there, frozen, the weight of it all pressing down. The game had just begun. The silence was deafening. The air felt thick with unspoken truths. He could hear the pounding of his own heart in his ears, loud and frantic. He stood motionless, staring at the place where she had just been. The key, the photo, the blade. Everything felt like it was swirling around him, spinning out of control. What had just happened? A distant noise broke through the silence. The soft click of a door opening, then closing again. She was still there, somewhere watching him. His instinct screamed to run. But where would he go? What would he do? He was trapped in this nightmare, and she held all the cards. His gaze snapped back to the safe, the documents still scattered across the floor. The photo, the truth. What had she meant by the game was bigger. Who else was pulling the strings? His breath was shallow as he crouched down, gathering the papers. The words blurred together in a rush of guilt and confusion. But it was the last letter, the one that slipped from the stack, that caught his eye. It was addressed to him. The handwriting was familiar. Asterisk her handwriting star. He ripped it open, his hands trembling. It read, "Asterisk, you think you're the only one with secrets, but you've made a mistake. You don't know who you're really dealing with. What you've started will be your undoing. The past is coming for you, and you won't be able to outrun it. Asterisk." His blood ran cold. The words didn't make sense. Was this a threat? A warning? The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Someone was coming. His heart stopped. He knew it wasn't her. The footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. The door to the penthouse creaked open, and he spun around, expecting to see her. But it wasn't her. It was someone else. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a stern face. His eyes locked on him, cold and calculating. "You've made a mess of things," the man said, his voice low. "Now it's time to clean it up." Before he could react, the man stepped forward. His hand reached out, gripping his shoulder with iron strength. "What do you want from me?" he gasped, trying to pull away. But the man's grip tightened. "You're in deeper than you think," the man said. "Much deeper. And if you want to survive, you'll do exactly as you're told." His mind raced. What had he gotten himself into? The man didn't wait for an answer. He moved quickly, pushing him towards the door, out of the penthouse and into the unknown. Everything was spiraling now. He was no longer in control, and he realized, with a sickening certainty, that whatever game she had started, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The chill in the hallway hit him like a gust of cold wind. The man's grip never loosened as he was shoved forward. His mind raced, but his body was rooted to the spot. Where were they taking him? What did this man want? Every instinct screamed to fight back, to break free. But the fear that gripped him made every attempt seem useless. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, metallic hum. The man's hand tightened on his shoulder, guiding him inside. There was no escape now. The doors closed, sealing them in. The air inside the small space felt suffocating. The soft hum of the elevator was the only sound, but it was deafening. The man didn't speak. He just stared ahead, his eyes cold and unreadable. Every second stretched, like the silence between them was heavy with unspoken threats. Finally, the elevator jolted to a stop. The doors slid open, and the man let him out. The corridor outside was dim, lit only by flickering lights. It felt like a forgotten part of the building, a place people had long since abandoned. Where were they? The man didn't stop. He pushed him forward again, guiding him down the narrow hallway. The walls were cracked, covered in grime. The air smelled damp, stale. At the end of the hallway, there was a door. The man opened it with a smooth motion, revealing a room that seemed entirely out of place. It was pristine, sterile, a sharp contrast to the decaying hallway outside. A table in the center, covered with papers and files. A single chair across from it. The man motioned for him to sit. He hesitated but obeyed. The chair creaked under his weight as he sank into it, his mind still racing. The man stood by the door, watching him intently. There was no escape, no way out. Finally, the man spoke, his voice cold and measured. "You've made a terrible mistake," he said. "You've gotten too close to things you don't understand." He swallowed hard, trying to force words past the lump in his throat. "What do you want from me?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the table, picking up one of the files. He held it up, as if presenting it to him. "Everything," the man said. "Everything you've done, everything you thought you knew, it's all connected. And now, it's time for you to learn exactly how deep this goes." His heart skipped a beat. "Connected?" The man flipped open the file, revealing a photo. It was of him again, but this time it was different. It was taken from a distance, almost like a surveillance shot. He didn't recognize the location, but the look on his own face, his expression, was unmistakable. "What's this?" he asked, his voice shaky. The man didn't answer immediately. He turned the page, revealing more photos, more of him, more places he had never been. "You've been watched," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "Everything you've done, every step you've taken, it's all been part of something much bigger than you." He felt his stomach twist. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. This was about something far darker. The man placed another document on the table. This one was a letter, and the handwriting was unmistakable. It was hers. The letter lay on the table, its words blurred slightly by the dim light, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Her handwriting. His heart pounded in his chest. He reached for the letter with trembling hands, the paper crinkling under his fingers. He unfolded it slowly, reading the words in a whisper, as if saying them out loud would somehow make them more real. Asterisk, you don't know what you've started. The game has changed. You were never meant to uncover what's behind it all. But now that you have, there's no turning back. I hope you're ready for what's to come. The past is catching up to you, and you'll soon see just how far it goes. Asterisk. His breath caught in his throat. The words sent a shiver down his spine. This wasn't just a letter. This was a warning. The man stood over him, watching him closely, his expression unreadable. "You see," the man began, his voice cold, "she's been playing you all along. But you've already figured that out, haven't you?" His mind spun. Everything was connected. The affair, the lies, the key, the photos. It was all part of something far bigger than he had imagined. "Why are you showing me this?" he managed to ask, his voice shaky. "Why me?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached down, pulling another folder from the table. He slid it across to him. "Because you're not the only one who's been kept in the dark," the man said. "You've been a pawn, just like everyone else. But now it's time for you to make a choice." He opened the folder. Inside were more photographs, more images of him, but this time The settings were more sinister. Dark alleyways, shady meetings, faces he didn't recognize, but the shadows surrounding them were all too familiar. "These people," the man said, leaning closer, "they're watching you. And they've been watching her, too." His head spun. Who were these people? What game was he really playing? The man's cold gaze locked onto his. "You've been dragged into something much deeper than you ever realized." The affair? It was just the beginning. He stood there, stunned, as the weight of the truth pressed down on him. Everything he thought he knew had been a lie. She had known. She had been orchestrating this from the start. The man stepped back, his hand resting on the door handle. "Your next move will decide everything," he said. "You can walk away, but that means walking away from her and the people who are pulling the strings." He could barely breathe. His thoughts were a whirlwind. If he walked away, what would it cost him? What would happen to her? The man gave him one last look. "Make your choice," he said, and then he was gone, leaving him alone in the sterile room, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He was no longer sure who the real enemy was. Was it her? The man? Or the shadowy forces that had been pulling the strings all along? One thing was certain. There was no going back. The door clicked shut behind the man, and silence engulfed the room once more. The heavy weight of the decision pressed on him. The photos, the letter, the cold truth. They spun in his mind like a whirlwind. He stood there motionless, staring at the closed door. Was there still time to run? Could he escape this nightmare, or was he already too deep? His eyes drifted to the folder on the table, the one that had been slid toward him. He could feel the weight of it pulling him in, urging him to look further. But he didn't want to know. He knew it would only make things worse. His fingers hovered over the folder, almost as if they had a mind of their own. Finally, with a hesitant breath, he opened it. The first photo was of a man, familiar, but not someone he'd ever expected to see. It was of her, but not the woman he had been having the affair with. Another woman, the same cold, calculating eyes, the same dark power behind her gaze. His stomach twisted. She was behind this. She had orchestrated everything. But why? What was her game? He quickly flipped through the pages, his heart racing. Each one revealed more connections, more people tied to the web of deceit that he had unknowingly stepped into. A name stood out on one of the documents. Alistair Grant. He had seen that name before. It was connected to a powerful business mogul, someone whose influence stretched far beyond what he could imagine. But there was more. A series of transactions, bank accounts, and meetings that painted a picture far darker than he had anticipated. This wasn't just about love or betrayal. This was about power, money, and control. And he was caught right in the middle of it. His mind raced. What was the real truth? And how had he become part of this twisted game? Suddenly, he heard the soft click of the door again. He tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the folder. But the door didn't open. It was just a shadow moving across the room. A figure stepped out from the corner of the room, and his heart stopped. It was her, the woman from his affair. Her face was pale, her eyes cold, almost empty. But she was here, and she was smiling, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You've been digging," she said, her voice like a quiet whisper. "You've been asking questions you shouldn't have asked." He stood frozen, the folder still in his hand. "Why? Why all of this?" he managed to ask, his voice thick with disbelief. Her smile faded, and for a moment, her expression flickered, something almost vulnerable in her eyes. But it was gone just as quickly. "Because, my dear," she said, stepping forward, "the game has always been about power." His stomach dropped. He thought he understood, but now he realized he didn't. "Power over what?" he demanded. "What have you been using me for?" She took another step closer, her movements almost predatory. "Not just you. Everyone." She paused, and for the first time, He could see the darkness in her eyes. This was never just about you and me. It's about control. And now, you're part of it whether you like it or not. His throat tightened. Everything was spiraling. There was no escape. Her words hung in the air like a death sentence. A part of it. The phrase echoed in his mind, pulling him deeper into the chaos he had unknowingly walked into. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. What could he say? How could he fight something this massive, this deep? Her smile twisted again, just slightly, as she saw the confusion and fear in his eyes. "I see the wheels turning in your head," she said softly, almost mockingly. "You think you can still get out, don't you?" He wanted to deny it, but the truth was right in front of him. There was no way out. Not anymore. She stepped closer, her presence swallowing up the space between them. His skin prickled with a sudden wave of unease. "You're in too deep," she continued, her voice almost a lullaby. "You've seen too much, and now you belong to us. Whether you like it or not." His heart hammered in his chest, his thoughts a blur of confusion and panic. What did she mean by belong? "What do you want from me?" he managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. "I've already given you everything." Her cold eyes glinted, and for a moment he thought he saw something, just the faintest flicker of amusement. She reached out, her fingers brushing his jaw lightly, as if she were caressing a delicate, fragile thing. "You've given me nothing," she said. "You've been a pawn, a distraction. Nothing more." His chest tightened. "Pawn, distraction?" She moved back, her hands clasped in front of her. "Everything you thought you knew," she continued, "it's all a lie. You've been nothing but a piece in a much larger game. You just haven't realized your role yet." He felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. His thoughts were racing, but they felt like they were running in circles. This was bigger than he could have ever imagined. He began, but the words caught in his throat. How could he even begin to grasp what she was saying? "Don't speak," she interrupted softly, her voice no longer sweet but sharp. "Just listen." She turned her back to him, her heels clicking against the cold floor as she walked to the table. The photographs, the documents, they lay spread out. Like pieces of a puzzle he was too terrified to finish. "They think they can control me," she muttered, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the files. "They're wrong." He stepped forward, heart pounding. "Who are they? What do you want from me?" She turned slowly, her eyes piercing into his. "They've been watching you, too," she said with an unsettling calm. "They think you're just a man in a game you don't understand. But you're more than that. You're the key." The key? What was she talking about? She raised her eyebrows, a twisted smile playing at the corner of her lips. "Did you really think the affair was the worst part of this? You're so much more important than that." Every muscle in his body tensed. He was in the middle of something that had already been set in motion long before he ever walked into her life. His mind was still struggling to catch up, but one thing was clear. Whatever he thought he was a part of, it was nothing compared to what was about to happen. She stepped toward him, closer now, her breath cool against his skin. "You've got a choice to make," she said, her voice low, dangerous. "You can play along and embrace your role in this twisted game, or you can try to run. But we both know there's nowhere left for you to hide." His blood ran cold. The words cut through him, sharp as a blade. "Choose wisely," she whispered, "because if you choose wrong, there will be consequences you can't even begin to imagine." The air around him seemed to crackle with tension. For the first time since this nightmare began, he understood one thing. There was no escape from the mess he had gotten himself into. Her words settled over him like a suffocating cloud. Consequences he couldn't fathom. The weight of the choices before him felt unbearable. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. What had he gotten himself into? How had a simple affair turned into this? She stepped even closer now, so close that he could feel the coolness of her breath against his skin. Her eyes, dark and unblinking, studied him with a cold intensity. And in that moment he knew this wasn't about her or him, or even the affair. This was about something far bigger. She was part of a world he had never understood, a world where power, manipulation, and control were the only rules. And now he was caught in its web. "Do you think you can just walk away?" she asked softly, her voice almost a taunt. "You think you can run? You can't. We've already seen everything. Every step you take, every move you make. It's already been planned." He wanted to scream, to lash out. But something inside him, the same feeling that had kept him frozen in this nightmare, held him in place. "You're a pawn," he thought. "Nothing more. I can't," he said, his voice barely a whisper. But even as the words left his lips, he knew it wasn't true. He could try to run, to fight back. But what would that accomplish? "That's right," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "You can't. Not now. Not anymore." Her hand brushed against his cheek, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of something human in her eyes. But it was gone too quickly, replaced by the coldness he had come to fear. She stepped back, her posture poised, the smile never quite reaching her eyes. "You think I've been manipulating you?" she asked, her voice a low murmur. "You're not the first one, and you won't be the last. But you might be the most interesting." His pulse quickened, fear rising in his throat. "What do you want from me?" The smile stretched across her face, colder now, more predatory. "I told you. You're the key." His mind reeled. Key to what? What had he done that made him so important? "I don't understand," he muttered, shaking his head. She chuckled, a low, unsettling sound that sent a chill crawling up his spine. "Of course you don't. You were never meant to understand. That's the point." His confusion deepened, but then a realization hit him like a freight train. It was never about him. Not really. He was just a pawn in her larger game, a game with stakes far beyond his comprehension. "Why?" he asked, barely able to breathe. "Why me?" She didn't answer at first, but her smile deepened, and in that moment he saw a flash of something dark and almost pleasure-filled in her eyes. "Because, my dear," she said, her voice almost sweet now, "you're more useful than you'll ever know." She turned away, her heels clicking on the cold floor as she moved toward the table once more. "Now," she continued, "it's time for you to make your choice." His breath hitched. "What choice?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Her hand hovered over the papers spread across the table. She didn't need to say anything. Her actions spoke louder than words. This wasn't about an affair anymore. It was about power. And whatever she had planned, it was just beginning. "You choose how this ends," she said, her back still turned. "You can play along, or you can defy us. But know this, either way the game will never end. Not for you. Not for anyone." He stood there frozen as she finished gathering the documents. His mind was a blur, unable to process everything she had just said. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in. Was there any way to win, or had he already lost? And as he stared at her, his thoughts swirling in an ocean of dread, he realized that whatever path he took now, it would lead him down a road he could never walk back from. The game had already begun. And it wasn't just about him anymore. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating, as if the very room itself had become a trap. Every step, every word, every decision, asterisk, everything asterisk, was part of the game. He didn't know what to think anymore. His mind raced, but the answers didn't come. The more he tried to make sense of it all, the more impossible it seemed. She turned back to face him, her expression unreadable, almost clinical in its detachment. She was waiting for him to make the first move, but how could he? What was there to choose? He took a shaky breath, his voice barely a whisper. "And if I refuse?" Her lips curled, into a thin smile. Refuse. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if savoring his uncertainty. You can't refuse. You already are part of this. He felt the chill of her words sink into his bones. This wasn't just some twisted affair. This was something much darker, more dangerous. She was right. He had already stepped too far into this world. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Her eyes gleamed with something he couldn't quite place. "First," she said, her voice smooth, "you need to understand the stakes. This is no longer just about you and me." She took a few steps back, circling the room like a predator stalking its prey. "The people you've seen in the photos, they're not just random faces. They're connected to something much larger. And you," she paused, "are going to help us bring it all down." He felt his stomach churn. "Bring what down?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was afraid to hear the answer. Her smile grew wider, but it wasn't comforting. "You'll understand soon enough." She held up one of the photos from the table, one of the shadowy figures in the background. "These are the ones pulling the strings. They think they're untouchable, but we're going to change that." His head was spinning. "You want me to, what? Help you take down these people?" She tilted her head, her gaze intense. "You've been a part of their world for longer than you realize. You've had access to things, people, information. Everything you've learned so far, everything you've seen has been leading up to this moment." His hands shook, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He wanted to run, but where could he go? This wasn't something he could outrun. "I don't want any part in this," he muttered, his voice cracking. "I just want to leave." She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Her voice was low, almost comforting, but the threat beneath it was unmistakable. "You're already too deep. You can't leave." She stepped closer again, her presence overwhelming. The room seemed to close in on him, the air thick with tension. "You've been marked," she said softly, almost gently, like a mother soothing a child. "And once you're marked, there's no turning back." Her words felt like a death sentence, each syllable burning into his mind. "There's no turning back." His pulse raced. He tried to steady his breathing, to clear his mind, but it was impossible. He felt trapped, chained to this dark, twisted world that he hadn't even known existed a few weeks ago. "Tell me what you want," he finally said, his voice low, resigned. Her smile was satisfied now, almost predatory. "We need you to gather information, be our eyes and ears. Everything you've seen, every conversation you've overheard, it's all part of something much bigger." He shook his head, his stomach churning. "I can't do this." She stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his. "You don't have a choice. You never did." Her voice dropped lower, the words colder, harder. "You're going to help us. And when it's over, you'll be more than just a player. You'll be one of us." The words settled over him like a death sentence. More than a player, one of them. But as she spoke, something inside him snapped. He wasn't just going to sit back and let her control him. There had to be a way out. He wasn't sure how, but he had to find it. But just as the thought flickered in his mind, she raised a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. His heart stopped. From somewhere outside the room, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, heavy, deliberate, and then the unmistakable sound of a door opening. Someone else was coming, and they were closing in. The footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing through the corridor. His pulse quickened. He didn't know who was coming, but the feeling in the pit of his stomach told him it wasn't good. She didn't flinch, didn't even look toward the door. Her eyes remained fixed on him, watching him carefully, as if she were studying his every reaction. But there was something different now, something almost anticipatory in her expression. The door creaked open, and the figure that stepped inside was a shadow, dark and imposing. For a moment, all he could see was the outline of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in black. The man didn't say a word, just stood there in the doorway, his presence heavy, suffocating. His eyes flicked between the man and the woman. Who was this? Without breaking eye contact with him, she finally spoke. Meet someone who knows exactly how far this game can go. Her tone was light, almost casual, but the words sent a chill down his spine. The man stepped forward, his movements deliberate and precise. There was an aura about him, an air of authority, of power, that made the room feel even smaller. He couldn't breathe. What was happening? The man stopped just a few feet away, his gaze flicking to the photographs on the table. For a moment, his face remained unreadable. Then he spoke. "You've seen too much already." His voice was gravelly low. And with that, his eyes shifted to him. "There's no turning back." His heart slammed against his chest. Again, with the no turning back. The woman smiled as if she were pleased with the tension in the air. "Are you ready to play your part?" she asked, her voice smooth, like a game she had been playing for far too long. The man said nothing, but there was something in his presence, something that made the air crackle with electricity. The door shut behind the man with a soft click. He felt the room closing in again. He was surrounded. The woman stepped forward now, reaching into a drawer beside her, pulling out a small device. She placed it in front of him. A phone. No, not just any phone. It looked like something out of a spy movie, black, sleek, with a single button on the side. "Everything you need is on there," she said, her voice low, almost like a whisper. "And you're going to use it." He reached out, taking the device, feeling the weight of it in his hand. The phone felt strangely cold, like it was filled with secrets he had no idea how to handle. "What do you want me to do with it?" he asked, his voice thick with uncertainty. She tilted her head slightly, her smile never leaving her face. "Everything is already set in motion," she replied. "You're the key. You'll have to choose how you play this." The man beside her spoke for the first time since entering the room. His voice was low, threatening. "You'll either help us or become our enemy." His stomach churned. The words hung in the air like a warning. "Help us or become our enemy." There was no room for negotiation. For a moment, all he could do was stare at the device in his hand. His mind raced, spinning with the weight of his options, the fear that gnawed at him, and the realization that he had walked into something he couldn't undo. The woman stepped back, her eyes glinting with amusement. "Now you decide." She nodded toward the phone, and for the first time, her voice softened, almost coaxing. "You can still walk away from this, or you can be one of us." The words hit him like a freight train. One of us. And for the first time, he realized he didn't want to be one of them. But he had no idea how to escape. The man's voice cut through the haze of his thoughts. "It's already begun." And that was when he knew. There was no choice anymore. Whatever game he thought he was in had already swallowed him whole. The weight of the phone in his hand felt like a lead weight, pulling him down into the abyss. It was cold. Too cold. A reminder of how far he'd fallen, how little control he had left. The woman's eyes bored into him, calculating, waiting. She was still smiling, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. She knew exactly what was happening in his mind. The man next to her moved, the air around him growing heavier with each step. His presence was suffocating, like a storm closing in. "You've already seen too much," the man repeated, his voice low and steady. He took a step forward, his gaze locked on the phone in his hand. "And if you choose the wrong side, there are consequences. You'll become the very thing you fear." The words sent a shiver through him. The very thing you fear. What did that mean? What would they do to him if he refused? The woman leaned forward slightly, as if sensing the hesitation in his movements. "You have to understand," she said softly, almost coaxingly. "There's no turning back. Not anymore." He couldn't breathe. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. He needed an answer, but the question that kept racing through his mind was what kind of world had he stumbled into? "You're playing a dangerous game," he said, his voice barely audible. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "I didn't ask for this." The woman's smile faltered for a brief moment, but only for a second. Then she straightened, her expression cold once more. "You think you have a choice? You don't." The man beside her spoke again, his voice heavy. "You think you're the only one who's been caught in this web? You're not. But you're the only one with access. And that makes you important." Important. His heart pounded. He didn't want to be important. He didn't want any part of this twisted world. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm, and for the briefest moment, he felt the coldness in her touch, a coldness that seemed to seep into his very skin. "You can fight it if you want," she said, her voice low and sweet. "But you won't win." He looked at the phone again, his mind racing. Was this how it ended? With him as part of their game? Or was there still a way out? She stepped back, folding her arms across her chest. "Your move," she said simply. The silence that followed felt thick, suffocating. He couldn't decide. His instinct screamed at him to run, to leave this nightmare behind. But how? The phone in his hand was no longer just an object. It was a symbol of everything he'd learned, everything he couldn't unlearn, and with it, the power to make the choice that would seal his fate. He glanced between the man and the woman. Both of them were waiting. But was anyone ever truly free in this game? Finally, his voice broke the silence. "I can't be part of this. I can't." The words felt like a betrayal of everything that had been drilled into him, everything that had been so carefully set in motion. But it was all too much. He couldn't play their game. Not anymore. The woman's smile returned, colder than ever. "You think you can walk away?" she asked, her voice sharp, the sweetness gone. "You can't. You've already chosen." He took a step back, but the air in the room felt like it was closing in on him. The man took a step forward. "You don't get to choose," he said, his voice filled with menace. "You're already part of this. There's no escape." The words echoed in his mind. No escape. And that was when it hit him. The truth that had been lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to reveal itself. The game wasn't just a game anymore. It was a trap. And no matter how hard he tried, he had already fallen into it. His hands shook as he gripped the phone, the device now feeling like a ticking bomb in his palm. He had no choice. No matter how much he fought it, the path was set. The woman's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "Welcome to the game," she said, her tone as cold as the steel that now felt embedded in his chest. And then, for the first time since this nightmare had started, he realized there was no turning back. The game was only beginning. The room seemed to darken, as though the walls themselves were closing in, pressing against his chest. His mind screamed for a way out, but his body was frozen, trapped in a web of choices he hadn't made. The woman's words lingered in the air, their weight pressing down on him like an iron vice. "Welcome to the game." He wanted to throw the phone, to smash it into the ground and escape, but his hand gripped it tighter, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. The man beside her moved forward again, his eyes narrowing as if measuring every inch of his movements. "Are you ready?" the man asked, his voice low and dangerous. But the question wasn't a choice, it was a command that resonated with the dark inevitability of everything he had learned so far. I can't do this." His voice trembled as he spoke, each word like a plea, a desperate cry for freedom. But the woman's gaze never faltered. Her cold smile remained, as though she had heard this exact confession 1,000 times before. "You can. You will." Her words echoed in his mind, louder than ever, and he realized, they were right, there's no way out. Not anymore. His body felt like it was moving on its own as he took a hesitant step toward the table, where the phone now lay, its dark screen reflecting the dim light around them. His fingers hovered over it, unsure whether he wanted to confirm what they had already decided for him. He knew, deep down, that touching it would seal his fate, but the thought of what might happen if he didn't terrified him just as much. The woman's voice, softer now, seemed to lull him into a trance. "You're a part of this world now. You can't go back. No one can." Her eyes glinted with something he couldn't quite place, but it felt like a warning wrapped in a promise. He wanted to fight back, to throw the phone and scream for help, but the truth was too heavy on him. There was no one out there who could save him from this. Not anymore. Suddenly, the phone vibrated in his hand, the buzz feeling like a pulse in his veins. He glanced down at the screen. A message. His fingers trembled as he unlocked it. The message was brief, but the implications were enough to make his stomach churn. Asterisk, your first task is simple. Get to the meeting point. Don't ask questions. Just do it. Time is ticking. Asterisk. The message was cold, detached, as though it were an order, a command. He swallowed hard, his breath quickening. This was happening. It was real.